Well, I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Also, were able to worship the Lord Jesus and give Him the praise that is due His name Sunday. Today, we're continuing our Bible reading plan. We are in 2 Samuel 5. So we skipped chapter 4. In chapter 4, Saul's son, who had been made king of the northern 11 tribes, Ishbosheth, is murdered, and so on. And in chapter 5, David is now made king of all the Jewish tribes, not just Judah, but the other 11. So he's the king now of the entire nation, all 12 tribes. And there's some lessons, I think, from this chapter that can help us, that we can apply to our lives for how to live and how to lead. There's several positive lessons. There's also one negative lesson. And please stick with the devotion, because at the end I want to explain a couple of things in this chapter that might confuse you when you read it. Now, first, the positive lessons. One, David knew that all of his blessings and all of his success, the position that he was in as king, were not of his own doing, his own making, but they were blessings or gifts from God. Notice in chapter 5, in verse 12, David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that God had exalted his kingdom. So he realized that his position and the success of his leadership was because of God. Back in verse 10 of chapter 5, David became greater and greater, for the Lord God of hosts was with him. So the first positive lesson is to remember that success and blessings, no matter how gifted we are the gift of God. And when we forget that, we get in trouble. Number two, a second lesson is that David realized that God blessing him with abilities and with success and with this position of leadership was not for David's sake, but for the sake of God's people and God's kingdom and God's purpose. Look at verse 12 again. David realized the Lord had established him as king and had exalted his kingdom. Notice the end of verse 12. For the sake of David. No, for the sake of his people Israel. In God's kingdom, leadership and service are for the benefit and blessings of others, not the one leading, not the one serving. Now, do we receive blessings when we serve? Receive blessings when we lead? Of course. But the real purpose is the benefit of God's people. So the opportunities God gives us, the talents He gives us, they are His gifts to us. And it's not because of us, it's because of Him. And it's not for our sake, it is for the benefit of His people. Now, the third positive lesson for living as a disciple and leading in God's ministry from this chapter is that David depended on God and consistently sought God's guidance, God's direction in making decisions and putting together plans and so on. Look in chapter 5, at verse 19. The Philistines are coming toward Jerusalem, toward Israel, to do battle with Israel. And in verse 19, David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David leads the army, and they win a great battle. Time passes. The Philistines come back to fight again. And again in verse 23, David inquired of the Lord. And God told him what to do. So you see these positive attributes in David that are lessons for us in how to live and how to lead. To realize that all of our blessings, opportunities, success, gifts, and so on, they're gifts from God. That He gives those to us for the sake of His people, His kingdom, and His purpose. And that we are continually to depend on God and seek His guidance in making decisions and not become so cocky, so confident that we've got it all together and we know what to do and we don't need God. We don't need God's blessing. We don't need God's direction. Now, nobody would just stand up and say that, but one of the temptations we face when God blesses, temptations we face when God gives us success, Temptations we face when over time we see God's hand at work, we begin thinking it's us, not Him. We begin thinking, well, it's how am I benefited from this? Not what is God's purpose in blessing His people and His kingdom. And we stop depending on God. We stop praying. We stop seeking God's guidance. And that's when leaders get in trouble. That's when we in our individual lives as followers of Christ get in trouble. When we get so used to God's presence and so used to God's help and so used to God's blessing and so used to all God is doing that we forget that it's God and start thinking it's us and we don't need Him. It's a subtle thing, but it leads to defeat in life and it leads to defeat in leadership. Now, the negative lesson is in verse 13. In the midst of all that David was doing right, he did one thing wrong, and it laid the groundwork for his greatest failure while king. In chapter 5, verse 13, meanwhile, while all this other is happening, David took more concubines and wives and had more children by them. Now, most of that was for political reasons. There would be treaties and arrangements with other groups, other nations, and it was very common, and it was that way for centuries, even up in the world until a couple of centuries ago, that kings would take another wife. They'd marry someone. It was a political arrangement, and David was doing that. But back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, centuries before, 350 years before King David, Moses told the people of Israel in his day that there would come a time when their descendants wanted a king. And he said a lot of things about it. But one thing Moses said in Deuteronomy 17 was that king was not to take for himself other wives. He was not to have multiple wives. And Moses said the reason is that his heart will be torn away. His heart will be torn away from God. Now you jump ahead, and we'll read this in future weeks in the book of 1 Kings. Solomon, with all of his wives, we're told that his wives turned his heart in his old age away from God toward idols. Not that he totally abandoned God, but he became polytheistic, if you will. And what was David's greatest failure? David's greatest sin? Bathsheba. Because once he started down the road of having multiple wives and everything, Bathsheba for him just became another one that he wanted. And here you have the seeds of what ultimately cost David dearly. So the application is that a little bit of disobedience in the midst of great success, if we don't face and deal with that little bit of disobedience down the road, leads to bigger failure, bigger sin, bigger problems. You cannot leave small areas of disobedience unchecked in your life, because if you do, they're going to get bigger and create problems later on. So that's the lesson. That's the takeaway. Now, real quickly, a note. In verse 21, David and his army, after defeating the Philistines, collected their idols that the Philistines had carried with them into battle for good luck, if you will, and they carried them away with them. Well, they didn't keep those idols. We read over in 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verse 12, that they later burned them and, I guess did something else with the gold or the silver or whatever material, precious metal the idols were made from. Also in chapter 5, verses 6 and following, when David and his army captured Jerusalem and make it the capital, there's some talk about the blind and the lame, and depending on your translation you're reading from, that can be confusing, hard to understand. What's going on is David made Jerusalem the capital of his new kingdom for two reasons. One, it was neutral territory. At this point, it had been ruled by the Jebusites, not Jewish people. And so it was not in territory controlled by Judah or territory controlled by the 11 northern tribes. It was neutral. So that was a good political move. That was smart. A second reason was it was one of the easier places to defend, because Jerusalem was on a hill, surrounded on three sides by a valley, which would make it more challenging to attack and easier to defend. And on the one side, the northern side that did not have a valley, he built a fortress, a structure called a Milo in the Bible, where he could easily defend that weaker part of the city, if you will. And the Jebusites, who were the inhabitants of the city, were so confident they could defend it. What they're really saying is even the blind and lame can defend Jerusalem. We're not worried about David capturing it. And David and his soldiers entered the city through a tunnel, a water channel that fed water into the city that went under one of the walls. That's how they got in there, sort of like the when Babylon fell. That's how the enemy got into Babylon and conquered that city at a different time in history. And David kind of sarcastically says, "I'm going to give a reward to the first one of you, quote unquote, who kills one of those lame and blind that they think can defend this city." It's not really talking about the lame and blind. It's just that the Jebusites were saying this is an easy place to defend, and David says, "Yeah, really. Well, I'm going to reward the first man that kills one of those." It's not that it can be taken. So it's a sarcastic response. So those are just some notes, and then one final thing. And I know I'm going a little longer today, but one final thing. Going forward in our reading plan, we're going to be jumping around between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, and then later we get into 1 and 2 Kings, and we'll be in 1 and 2 Chronicles and back and forth. And the reason is that Chronicles, along with 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, so 2 Samuel, 1, 2 Kings, a lot of what's told in those books is also recorded in 1 and 2 Chronicles, but one of them may give us more details or different details. And so we will look at those chapters that are covering the same story at times to pick up more information. So in today's reading, you were reading in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, the first 9 verses, which talks a little bit more about David capturing Jerusalem. So we're going to be doing that. And later when we get into Kings, we may stop in the reading plan. You go over to Jeremiah or Isaiah. And so when you're reading something in Kings, for instance, that took place during Isaiah's life or during Jeremiah's life, we're going to stop and go read the appropriate chapters in the prophets. So you're reading everything chronologically. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next 2 or 3 years as we go through our reading plan, taking in these historical books of the Old Testament. So, hey, that's a lot for today. Thank you for hanging in there with me, and I'll see you tomorrow, and hopefully it'll be a little bit quicker.